The second set of questions I want to talk about concern whether the logic of consequence and the logic of appropriateness are used sequentially, or you transition across them, or whether they can be used coterminously or combined in some way. And this comes from Alistair's question of, do organizations naturally transition from a logic of consequence to a logic of appropriateness over time? And from Shirley's question, which is, can decisions involve both the logic of appropriateness and consequence? And I think that the answer is yes. These are two modes of rationalization, right? And it's feasible that firms can switch between them, and they can even embed them in certain ways. So just to give you an example, some of you talked about how I can confront a new problem where I don't have known solutions, right? I mean, or at least I can predict, but then I make a decision on consequence basis, and it goes well. And so the next time I see that problem, I'm going to enact it again as a rule. And in that case, a logic of consequence becomes kind of a logic of appropriateness. So we do see this kind of behavior of best practices learned, which I think Elizabeth mentions in her post, and I think that was a very insightful comment. There are some complications to it, a little bit, to how we do these sequences, in that I do think that it's not always that rule following is second, it can be first in some cases. That we think about what the general, the most appropriate identity and its matches in terms of some general class of behaviors, right? And then we think within that class of behavior, we have various options of action, and we think about their consequences and decide within those. And this is kind of what Lottie did under Shirley's question, where she talked about the logic of appropriateness setting general rules or goals that we match on, and then within that set of standard operating procedures, we weigh them in terms of which one has the best consequence. And she talks about that with regard to the national park that she works with. So that was a kind of a neat example of the reverse kind of sequence of sorts. But you can also think of it as a hierarchical embedding of one logic within the other. I think it's also important to think that rule following can be somewhat prospective in a way. It's not always reactive. I can look to other firms outside of my firm, and it's not just my own experiences that I rely on in terms of finding matches with identities and standard operating procedures. I can look around at what other companies do and borrow from them in a logic of appropriateness way. And more than that, the application of rules and matching isn't always static or fixed. We adapt them. We find misfits. In terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the naval blockade, it was misapplied, at least from one standpoint of the administration, and they had to adapt it. So we do see this kind of adjustment going on with the logic of appropriateness. And I don't think many of us kind of often consider. In the case of Shirley's question, Michael had a good example of how the logic of consequence you begin with that, and then the logic of appropriateness is used as an afterthought, as kind of a check. So in the case of a military, you may think of the optimal option of action in terms of success, but then check it in terms of whether you are violating the Geneva Conventions or some kind of a violation of code. We actually see this in a lot of other organizations, not just the military, in terms of when you have hiring in the United States, we often try to find the best candidate, and then we make sure after the fact that hopefully we were following diversity considerations, that we weren't prejudiced in our sampling of these individuals, and that we checked every outlet. Or vice versa, in a lot of cases that we try to do that first.